As I record this episode, the number one podcast in the world, when measured by downloads per episode, is Candice, which features conservative political and social commentator Candice Owens. Owens has not held this title long. In fact, her rapid rise to number one on the charts is directly linked to her conspiratorial framing of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Now, whatever one thinks about the legitimacy and reasonableness of Owens' conjecturing, one thing is for certain. The internet loves conspiracies. Conspiracy theories have found fertile soil in the networked digital environment, where they are absolutely thriving today. As an aside, it's important to be aware that conspiracy theories can be constructed in different ways. One especially slick way of conspiratorial theorizing, so popular on social media right now, is by employing the interrogative mood as a rhetorical device. In other words, instead of directly stating the conspiracy thesis in plain words or in the indicative mood, the theory is indirectly suggested through the use of questions. This suggestive use of questioning gives the impression of genuine truth-seeking and inquiry. And this indirect method is especially annoying because it uses questions to mask conspiratorial theorizing without committing to propositional claims that could be refuted. Now, when pressed, one can always fall back on the "I'm just asking questions" defense. No, you're not just asking questions. You're using questions to suggest a conspiracy in an indirect way. Anyway, to tell the full story of why conspiratorial thinking has become so commonplace and attractive in our society of late, we need to consider wider cultural influences over the last several decades involving, for example, political scandals, bureaucratic cover-ups, and media bias, just to name a few. Generally speaking, there is today a pervasive distrust in our societal institutions: political, bureaucratic, educational, journalistic, medical, and even religious. And this growing cynicism was accelerated during the COVID pandemic when various institutions, including our own government and legacy media, conspired to propagandize the American public. It's really not surprising then that there's a general mood of skepticism and suspicion in the air today. It's an atmosphere that is fueling the growth and attractiveness of conspiratorial theorizing. But here in this episode, I want to set these larger societal movements aside and instead focus on the way in which the structure of the digital environment itself is contributing to the escalation of conspiratorial thinking. Now, one obvious way that this is happening is that the internet, and especially social media, has provided a platform for the popularization and for the proliferation of conspiracy theories. I mean, there's no question that today we are far more exposed to conspiracy theories than ever before in human history. But I want to argue, however, that the digital environment is not just exposing us to conspiracy theories, but that it's actually disposing us to conspiratorial thinking. That is to say, the digital environment is structuring our cognitive habits toward the conspiratorial. Conspiratorial thinking, then, is an example of what I've referred to in this series on the dangers of the digital age as the perverse psychological attunement that we undergo in our use of digital technology. I think there are several ways in which the digital environment habituates us toward the conspiratorial. The first and most obvious way is by providing access to an unbounded flow of information. It's remarkable when you think about it that each of us walk around today with a near infinite source of data in our pockets, now made hyper-accessible by artificial intelligence. But exposure to such a rapid flow of information is not natural to us as human beings. As Dr. Brian Kempel pointed out in the last episode in this series, humans are not global animals. We're not designed to be subjected to the constant flood of chaotic and disintegrated and unfiltered information from all over the world. To cope with this digital deluge and to avoid cognitive overload, we naturally filter and structure the information to make it more manageable for us. And we do this by applying some organizing principle by which we can bring order, unity, and coherence to the informational anarchy. An especially effective and natural organizing principle is that of narrative. Narrative is a natural means of cognitive focus, a method whereby we can select certain facts for consideration and exclude others. It's a way of imposing order on random data, a way of compressing complexity into manageable units of coherence. Of course, narrative is nothing new. It's as old as language. Humans have from the beginning utilized story to bring coherence to the world of experience. And as I said, it's an organizing principle that is natural to us, and it's cognitively easy for us. We all know how to tell a story. We all know how to structure information as parts ordered by a whole. It's not a cognitive exercise that requires specialized training. So it's not surprising that narrative has become something of an instinctive organizing principle for processing the flood of information in the digital environment. The connection between narrative on the one hand and conspiracy theorizing on the other is, I think, apparent. After all, a conspiracy theory is just a highly complex narrative specifically designed to account for some broad set of seemingly disparate facts. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with narrative. Narratives are not necessarily fictitious. Very often, our narratives map on to the relations that really do obtain in the mind-independent world. There are, after all, true accounts. There are true stories. There are also real conspiracies. The problem arises when this natural cognitive mode of thinking devolves into an intellectual vice. And this occurs when our use of narrative becomes untethered from reality. And as a result, our ability to discern the truth is diminished. Let's give this intellectual vice a name. We'll call it narrativism and define it this way. Narrativism is the cognitive habit of conflating narrative coherence with rational justification. Narrativism, to put in other words, is the tendency to substitute the telling of an internally consistent story for evidence-based reasoning. Narrativism confuses coherence with correspondence. It confuses internal consistency with external evidence. It's the inclination to choose the explanation that makes sense within a given framework, the explanation with the most narrative resonance, rather than the explanation that better corresponds with reality. To understand something online increasingly means that I can tell a story about it that feels coherent, that feels consistent with everything else I already believe. It's easy to see that narrative coherence is not enough for truth. A story may possess impeccable internal structure and yet be wholly false. For an account to be true, it must not only cohere with itself, it must correspond to reality. Coherence, then, is at best a negative test for truth, or as philosophers like to say, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. If some claim is true, it will not be internally contradictory, since reality itself is coherent and intelligible. But the reverse does not follow. An internally consistent narrative may still be a fiction. To determine whether a coherent story is true, we need reasons and evidence for thinking that its claims actually reflect the way the world is. Narrativism, it seems to me, is fast becoming a dominant form of reasoning in the digital environment. In response to the veritable flood of information online, people are seeking to find a narrative that they can hold on to, regardless of whether that narrative accords with the mind-independent world. None of us have the time or the resources to examine all the evidence behind all of the claims that are being made on the internet at any given moment in time. It's far easier and more efficient to evaluate the information that we encounter online in terms of its narrative resonance, rather than by the difficult and slow process of empirical confirmation and rational argumentation. Moreover, there is something that's very attractive about narrative reasoning. It can impose a kind of causal unity on seemingly random data. It can compress incomprehensible complexity into familiar explanations involving agents and motives and plot lines. It's emotionally satisfying. Narrative reasoning feels like disciplined, rational inquiry, even when it's not. So here's my claim in summary form. The digitization and hyper-access of information online is inclining us toward narrativism, and thus to conspiratorial thinking as a ready-to-hand means of avoiding cognitive overload. For minds that are habituated by the intellectual vice of narrativism, conspiracy theories will have strong appeal. But it gets worse, or so I claim, because not only are we being habituated towards conspiratorial thinking in our effort to manage the inundation of information in the digital environment, but the conspiracy theories themselves are becoming more appealing in the digital environment. And this for a simple reason. The unlimited information stream of the internet is providing an abundance of raw materials in the form of data for the construction of more comprehensive and sophisticated conspiracy theories. Here's an illustration to help visualize the point. A person looking at the night sky with the naked eye can draw some simple constellations around the visible points of light. Give the same person access to the Hubble telescope and the millions of points of light that it can see, and the constellations become far more detailed and impressive. As the illustration suggests, the digital environment acts as a near-infinite star field for conspiracy construction. Billions of data fragments, images, leaks, posts, documents, rumors, statistics, and decontextualized facts are constantly available on the internet. The mind inclined towards conspiratorial thinking now has far more points of light to connect, far more clusters to form, far more evidence to weave into a narrative, and far more opportunities to discover apparent correlations. Thus, the conspiratorial thinker can construct explanations that are more detailed, more internally complex, more seemingly comprehensive, and more dramatically unified. For those under the grip of narrativism, the more comprehensive the conspiracy theory, the more factoids it can account for, the more plausible it will seem. A conspiracy theory that integrates more facts will appear more credible. It will feel more intelligent, more complete, more explanatory. It will give the illusion of disciplined, rational inquiry. But in truth, complexity here is being mistaken for intelligence. Coherence is being mistaken for truth. Patterns are mistaken for causes. And explanatory scope is mistaken for plausibility. Another feature of the digital environment that is attuning us towards conspiratorial thinking has to do with its algorithms of engagement. The algorithms that govern the digital environment silently reward narrative over reason. They hide nuance, qualification, uncertainty, logical precision, and slow, disciplined inquiry. They reward patterns of thought that are quick, reactive, confident, dramatic, moralizing, and explanatorily broad, all traits of conspiratorial thinking. The algorithms prioritize affect over argument. They privilege emotionally charged, dramatic, agent-centered content. Digital platforms amplify outrage, indignation, fear, suspicion, and contempt, all emotions that conspiracy theories feed on. Moreover, the algorithms of engagement create the illusion of meaningful pattern by clustering similar content in user feeds. As a result, what the user sees is parallel content, reinforcing themes, repeated motifs, and data arranged in ways that appear non-random and meaningful. And this creates a false sense of pattern density. It feels like everything is pointing to the same conclusion. And in terms of our previous illustration, the algorithms create constellations that are pre-drawn by the system. The users then discover them in their feeds. But the patterns of meaning that we see in our social media feeds are not real. What we're actually seeing is an algorithmically curated echo of our own viewing habits. In the early days of the World Wide Web, the internet was often described as the information superhighway. The metaphor captured a widespread optimism, the belief that A global network of shared information would usher in an era of mutual understanding and even a common view of reality. But the opposite has happened. While the internet has indeed spread Western culture across the world, it has not unified our understanding of the real. It has, in fact, fractured it. The information superhighway has become a mechanism of intellectual isolation rather than unification, of ideological tribalism rather than global consensus. And as I've tried to show in this episode, part of the reason lies in the way the digital environment subtly and pervasively attunes us toward intellectual vices. Its very architecture amplifies cognitive tendencies that fuel narrativism and conspiratorial thinking. And so today, despite unprecedented access to the collective reserves of human knowledge, we find ourselves with nothing close to a shared understanding of reality. What we have instead is a sprawling economy of competing narratives, worlds of meaning held together not by truth, but by coherence, resonance, and the psychological ease of the story that feels right.